Welcome to Spotlight on the Real Science of Sport podcast with Professor Ross Tucker and Gareth Davies.
Hello everyone and welcome back to the Spotlight. This is the show, I always introduce it this way, that is sponsored by Discourse, not financially at all actually, although you do make those monthly pledges, but sponsored in the sense that the topics that we discuss on this show are the things that are being discussed over on our Discourse community, which is run and moderated by Gareth Davies, who as always joins me. How's things going, Gareth?
All good. Really looking forward to this one.
Yeah.
Mix of everything.
Yeah, we've got a fairly physiology heavy show, which is nice and exciting. So we'll do our best to offer some physiological insights into the Discourse topics of the week, which, as I mentioned, are largely informed by your reactions to the podcast that we've put out. And in the last week, there have been two shows. The Spotlight, obviously, from a week ago, where our center stage topic was carbohydrates in the context of a paper that Tim Noakes has got out. And then on Monday, we released what I thought was a pretty interesting podcast on Andrew Feather. I haven't really gotten your thoughts on that, so I'm juggling our order around a little bit. We've got a much more in-depth look at something Andrew Feather spoke about later in the show. But what were your overall impressions of Andrew Feather, Gareth?
I quite enjoyed it because he seems to be a man after my own heart, because he likes climbing hills standing up, which I like to do, even though I've been trying to train myself to sit down more. And he didn't seem too bothered about really super structured training or the numbers, which is also a little bit like me. He seemed to just say, I'm going to go out and ride for 2.5 hours and just get it done. I enjoyed that. The bit that really not concerned me, but it was interesting, is about his diet. I know cycling is a weight-obsessed sport, isn't it? And his racing weight, I think, was 63 kilos. And you can see that he was having to restrict himself to get to that racing weight. And also he was going out on rides and perhaps using those as a way of getting his weight down as well, because he wasn't fueling on rides, which that really surprised me. So with the way sport is, and we talk about red S and underfueling, things like that, that little bit did concern me. And not just him, obviously, it's cycling in general isn't always the most healthy of sports. It brought that to mind.
Yeah, like Renato made the point on Discourse that pretty much everything where we wouldn't call it conventional wisdom, I'd call it even more than that, like scientific wisdom. He seems not to do much of it, with the exception of bicarb. That's why I was so surprised at the end when he said yes to the bicarb question. I was 100% sure he was going to say, no, don't bother with that. So I see what you're saying. One interesting thing about it is, I think it came across that he doesn't really pay attention to those types of things and so on. But I think if you read between the lines or listen between the answers, I think he probably does. Like the fact that he gets tested, he knows the VO2 max numbers, the FTPs, the CPs. I asked him about his power output for those 2-minute efforts, and he knew that it was 650. He spoke about the 6.2 being the best that he'd done. I think there's actually quite a lot more analysis and awareness of data behind what he does than he lets on. And one of the threads that sort of sprung off that podcast over on Discourse was about bicarb. And someone made the point, I forget who now, apologies, that the fact that he's talking about the bicarb the way that he does suggests that he's gone and he's tried things, he's learned, he's listened, he's read, and he's probably trying to apply certain things. So I wonder how much of it is really what we heard, or whether there's a lot more behind what was presented to us and told to us.
Because he doesn't race with power, does he? That's another thing that really surprised me.
Well, that's also weight, right? I mean, remember he said his bike's 5.4, and that's not even the lightest one on the sort of hill climbing circuit. But they are so concerned about weight. When you're going up a 2-minute climb at 15% or whatever the climbs are going to be, then the 200 grams or something of a power meter.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, that's why none of the elite mountain bike riders, remember we asked Marcel Guerini the same thing. They don't race with a power meter. They train with it, but when you race, you don't bother with it because of the weight penalty. And you can argue that. Some people have done this even on Discourse. It's probably obsessive, especially for us. I mean, if I was concerned about weight, there's about 100 things I could do other than drop a power meter. But anyway, I think that's probably part of it. And maybe he doesn't want the distraction.
Yeah, well, that's part of it. I think because he said about riding by feel, and it's nice to ride by feel. I don't particularly look at my head unit at all when I'm riding, unless I don't know where I'm going.
Especially in a race situation, and this is the key, if you're well connected to your body, because in a race situation, you've got the adrenaline, you've got the crowds, and there's a video actually that Charlie has posted on the Discourse about one of those hill climbs. If you haven't seen them yet and you're over there, then go and have a look, because you can imagine, to keep your head going up a climb like that, to manage your pace in those circumstances, you've got to be really dialed in without a power meter. So, but once you can do that, it's got to be the better way.
But the power meter can lie to you. On a certain day, you might not have that power. And if by sticking to it, you could put yourself in a deep hole, because you've got that physiological bank balance that you keep talking about. And only by really knowing your body do you know how you feel and whether you can sustain it or not.
Yeah, and the other way around, right? Because sometimes you're going to need to go 3 to 10%, whatever it is, better than you've ever gone before in a race situation. So why accept the power output, the power meter, the number on that device, when you know that you actually need to just find 3% more? Just go for it, you know. So it can be constraining in both directions, I think.
Yeah, well, we're going to get back to the Andrew there, because we're going to talk a little bit about the numbers later.
Correct. So that was the one part. Thanks for bringing me back on track. The other one was last week in the center stage on the carbohydrates. And as always, when we put something out there, and it was sort of put out there provocatively, in response to what I think is provocative, 10 grams per hour at a time when everyone's talking about going up by so much more. And as always, Discourse has responded with some pretty insightful points. And I know you've got a couple of those lined up to mention.
Because one of the things I was thinking about after it, I was thinking, were we entirely fair? Because is there anything that says that perhaps it's a good idea not to use so many carbs? And one of the things is that we don't know about the long-term use of high carb intakes. And Jamie Whitfield, who's been a podcast guest before, I know, he chipped in because he's a member on Discourse. He says, as to the point about the ultra high carb intakes potentially being unhealthy long term, and he says that's absolutely a fair point. However, there's not a great deal about truly elite endurance sport, there is Olympic level, that is healthy in a traditional sense. There's also no evidence that I'm aware of that long-term keto is healthy. In fact, that's the exact diet we give to mice in research to induce metabolic diseases.
Yeah, exactly.
What do you make of that one?
Exactly. No, he's right. It's to the point, straight to the point. I suppose the only thing you'd add there is that the carb thing is not just being used by elite athletes. It's being used by schmucks like me, who are now also trying to press up to 80, 90, 100 grams an hour when I do a 4-hour long ride or a 6-hour 100-mile race or whatever it is. So for us, exercise is meant to be a little bit healthy, because he's obviously right. The elite life and the 30 hours a week or something, sometimes in some endurance athletes of training and some of the other costs of being an elite athlete are there. But the fact that it becomes generic advice, I wonder if you could question that a little bit. But I agree, and some people in Discourse have made the point that you can go high carb in a couple of rides a week and then find other ways in your habitual diet to compensate and keep the overall balance high, because otherwise you're in danger of just massively over-consuming processed carbohydrates because you're taking 400 grams of them 4 times a week on the bike.
Because Bjorn says that. He says there's a difference between low-carb diet and low-carb performance fueling. And you could look at the other way around. There's a big difference between a high-carb long-term diet and high-carb performance fueling, which is just for certain things. And mathematics says the same thing. He says that you can take in huge amounts of carbs during a ride, but it doesn't leave you a lot of gap at the end of the day to sort of fill it in with healthy food, does it? So there are downsides to this high-carb method that we talk about.
Yeah, plus your teeth. I get back from a ride, I don't have to brush my teeth for about 20 minutes just to get the fur off them. It's crazy.
Yeah. But Sophie then says on the other side of it, she says underfueled athletes don't have consistent training. Carb intake during training and racing isn't just about improving performance in that particular session. It may also enhance the recovery as well.
Oh yeah, absolutely. That's been my experience. Not to pile on to bro science here, but I called it in the Discourse chat when I responded, readiness to repeat. Like a 3-hour ride, and then when do I feel like I'm ready to do that ride again? It's way faster when you've fueled the ride properly.
So yeah, it was every time fueling comes up, there was a cracking debate about it.
Yeah, and that was no different. And if you want to be part of those debates, obviously we've been talking a lot about Discourse. There's a link in the show notes down below on your players. You click on that takes you to Patreon, where you make that monthly pledge, and it gets you access to that community. You don't obviously have to comment or contribute. You can just read and see what other, I must say, very impressive insights are shared by our listeners. So if you value what we do and you want to get even more out of the podcast, that's where it all goes down afterwards. I usually say we begin, as always, with Discourse Digest, but we've begun already. But let's go to Discourse Digest. This is a sort of news wrap where we pick up on stories in global sports news and try and offer one or two sports science insights. And the first of those, I was really surprised when I read a headline that one of the great swimmers, certainly of the last 5 years, but I say will go down all time as one of the greats, has retired in her mid-20s.
Ariane Titmus, the Australian swimmer. So is 25 young for a swimmer? It's old for a gymnast, but young for a swimmer, because I think she said she's been in the pool since like the age of 9. So I think she's just fed up with it.
It's not young. It is getting to, like you say, they start so young. They're almost all swimming fairly significant training volumes when they're very young. I remember Spanish swimming physiologist said, you just have to earn the right to swim like a fish. And if you don't start really young, you don't get that. So you generally find that it's an early specialization sport. And so that's why we've seen many stories like this, like of athletes who start when they're extremely young, win medals in their teens, stretch that out for 2, maybe 3 Olympics and then go. But because it's such a low load on the body, and I'm not saying it's easy by any means, you get swimmers who swim real old. I mean, there was a 41-year-old medalist from the Olympics a few years back, Dora Torres, admittedly retired, came back maybe even more than once, took breaks, I'd rather say, than retired from swimming. Phelps swam into the 30s. Ledecky will be 30-something by the time Los Angeles comes around. So Titmus could have gone, definitely won more Olympics, maybe even a second. But I think made a choice, and in her own words, I think she just had a realization and didn't want the lifestyle anymore. It was just the grind. And I think she spoke also about a cancer scare that she'd had in the build-up to the Paris Olympic Games, and that changed her perspectives. And so fair enough, you walk away when, really, to answer your question, she's in the prime.
Yeah, which really the reason I'm bringing it up, because the first thing I thought of, and perhaps this is just the way my mind works, is that when I read about her retirement, I thought, is she going to turn up in the enhanced games? That's $500,000. It just popped into my head, because it doesn't help that we just seen that Shane Ryan from Ireland had said that he's going to join the enhanced games.
Yeah, exactly. That's just pattern recognition on your part, because I must be honest, the exact same thought occurred to me. I said, I hope this isn't going to be enhanced games.
No, but I posted that on Discourse, and Dylan, who's an Australian, says not a chance. Hell's going to freeze over first, because it's completely antithetical to her personality, and she's looking to move into the media with presenting. She has sponsorship deals, all of which would obviously go. And he said it would be the greatest scandal in Australian sports history if she did. So she won't.
Yeah, and fair enough. And I mean, thanks, Dylan, for the insight from down under. But it's true. Like, I think the enhanced games target market, or let's call them the athletes most vulnerable, are the almosts. Good, and sometimes even great, but then there's Titmus level great. And that's beyond what the enhanced games will entice, because the legacy's too big.
Not Fred Curley.
Yeah, but Fred Curley's good and almost great, but he's not Titmus level great in his sport. Level, that's for sure. Enough. Like, I mean, it's because you'd be tainting so much. When you look at Titmus's career, I think 2019 World Short Course Championships was her first big sort of global stage appearance where she won medals. She'd done well in other events like the Commonwealths and so on, winning a couple of golds. But short course, 2018. And from that period on, 19, 21, 22, 23, 24, every global championship she swam in, she won the 400-meter title. She set 6 world records in her career. She got 2 Olympic golds in the same event, the 400 freestyle, Tokyo, and then defended it in Paris. That race in Paris, remember, that was called the race of the century. We spoke about it in our show. It was the Ledecky, Titmus, McIntosh. So Titmus is like in the pantheon of Olympic, and in Australia they really value that, like your Olympic legacy is really valuable. So Curley walking away to chase bucks is different from Titmus doing it. Maybe because even if she needed it, I don't see her going. So I'm reassured by that, and I think it's the best defense against the enhanced games, actually.
Yeah, well, speaking of that defense against the enhanced games, I was sort of wondering if it's inequality in sport, especially financially, that's actually driving the enhanced games. Because, as I mentioned, the Irish swimmer Shane Ryan, he's decided to join them. He said he was proud and grateful for the chance to represent Ireland, but he had struggled to live on €18,000 a year, and that flaws in the Irish swimming administration impeded his progress. He says nobody really gives a shit too much about swimming except for every 4 years when the Olympics comes around. And I think that's fair enough. And if he's being offered $500,000 or whatever, then can you really blame the guy for now going after that money? Because he hasn't got that legacy to tarnish. And I wondered if it's only those that have got that legacy who have made a load of money that can afford to turn these things down. We're blaming the athletes for going and joining the enhanced games, but have they really got a choice, some of them?
Yeah, I mean, I've said before, even in Korea, because here's the thought to ponder, is the incentive to go and swim at the enhanced, or to race at the enhanced games, swim, run, ride, whatever your sport will be, is potentially money. I mean, I was like, 2 days ago, or yesterday, Fred Curley posted on Twitter, X, he said, "You're all after big things, we're after big bank." So, I mean, it's like so transparent, which is in a way refreshing, but it's just bucks. But Curley was after that when he was running on the World Athletics circuit as well. He was chasing Diamond League bucks. Or bank, or whatever the word I'm not down with it.
Big Bang. Yeah,
Big
you put
Bank
FK. I was thinking that was Faith Kipyegon. And I was like, that doesn't sound like her.
No, that's in our show notes. Big
Yeah.
bank, not bucks. I'm not down with what the cool kids say. But anyway, you get the idea. It's like all athletes have the same incentives before they join the enhanced games as well, right? If you came and dangled in front of someone and said, you know what, you're 18,000 a year here in this swimming program, but if you can win an Olympic gold medal, imagine how much more. And if you just open this little lunchbox, you'll find a few things that will help you do that. The point is that the incentive doesn't suddenly appear when you retire. It's there when you compete as well. But I take your point, and I've often said as well, if I was good enough, genetically, naturally, to be a professional athlete, but not quite good enough to win at it, I don't know how I would deal with that dilemma, knowing that I could dope to move myself into the next tier or even 2 tiers up and suddenly be a podium contender. Here come the sponsorships, here come the invites, here come the appearance fees, and I can make all that money that I reckon it would be quite easy to justify it to myself. And
so would you struggle morally, or do you worry about being caught?
I think it would be a moral dilemma. But if I could solve the logistical dilemma of being caught, I reckon many people would wriggle through that moral dilemma. And I'm not saying I would do it. I'm not here confessing to my doping inclinations. But I'm basically agreeing with you. I think the decision to do this, especially when now you retire, and you say, well, how am I going to pad my retirement? I'm 31 years old. I've got 50 years here that I still got to sustain and support. I've sacrificed 18 years of my life in the pool. Like, what's next? Well, here's something. So I can't begrudge people the opportunity to do it. I wish they wouldn't, and I'd like to think that I wouldn't either. But I can see why it is objectively. You can see the other side.
Because I mean, we see amateurs doping. We see amateurs getting caught.
Yeah, and that's a strange one.
So people, yeah, because to me, there's no achievement if I haven't achieved it myself. It'd be like putting a motor on my bike and winning something. It was just, what's the point?
Yeah, it would be so interesting to understand the journey that gets you from. I think most people would initially say that, and then at some point you make one small step, then another one, small change of direction. By the time you look up, you're facing the wrong way, and you've moved 100 yards off where you were.
If you're doing it for yourself, for self-esteem and achievement, then you're never going to do it. If you're doing it for the clicks on Instagram or for other people's praise, that's when you might do it. And that shows probably a personality defect in a way.
Yeah, exactly.
And so perhaps those people are more likely to dope anyway. I don't know. We're going slightly off topic.
No, but these are the important things. I mean, if you're a 42-year-old amateur and you're vying to come top 5 in a local race, I mean, so what? Like, get over it. But for some people, that status and that prestige is like it's worth too much to them. Anyway, it's that. On that note, actually, I noticed a story 2 days ago. Carl Lewis was in India promoting a half marathon of all things. Talk about strange fits there as an ambassador. But anyway, and he was asked about the enhanced games, and the quote was, "I just don't think people want to abandon faith in things that are right just for the sake of performance. It's not just about competing. Sports is about doing the right thing." Coming from whom that's coming felt a little bit fresh and a little bit naive, to be honest, because I think the thing I dislike the most about the enhanced games is they've shown that there is a group of people who would jump at this.
Mm.
That's what's not. The enhanced games is a lens on a side of society that I wish didn't exist.
It makes you uncomfortable.
Yeah.
So the next story, I've bumped it up because it sort of dovetails into this in my mind slightly. And it's about tennis and injuries in tennis. And you'll see the link in a minute. Because there's been a spate of injuries in tennis. Holger Rune has been the latest and probably the most catastrophic. He was injured in the Stockholm Open last weekend, I think it was. He's blown his Achilles out. Draper, the Briton Draper, is out at the minute. There've been quite a few other injuries. There's several women's players who've struggled with health and fitness. Osaka, Raducanu, who's forever, Svetlana, Badosa. There's been loads of tennis injuries. And so it's hit the headlines. American Taylor Fritz, it says here he won his Six Kings Slam exhibition match in Ryder on Saturday after Djokovic retired injured. He said Draper was right in seeking change. He says, facts, also seeing more injuries and burnout now than ever before. He's the world number 4, by the way. Because balls, courts, conditions have slowed down a lot, making the weekly grind even more physically demanding and tough on the body. And with that, he's referring to the fact that Jack Draper is saying that unless something happens, unless the ATP change things, there's going to be more and more injuries, and tennis is really in trouble. So we've been looking at some of the potential reasons that they've been mentioning behind this, haven't we?
Yeah, because it's an interesting debate, not unique to tennis. 2 weeks ago on this show, we spoke about rugby issuing some sort of load guidelines that are intended to achieve the same thing. Manage how much players play, manage the length of their off-season, extend their careers and minimize their risk of injury caused by wear and tear and overuse, basically, if you think of a player like that. Football's got the same problem. The Man United defender spoke about retiring early because it was just untenable to play 2 matches a week for 40 weeks a year. American football's got its collective bargaining agreements to try and manage load, both training and matches. So pretty much every sport grapples with this. Tennis is interesting because it seems to me that there are 2 things happening, not necessarily related. One is a calendar pressure where the ATP and the WTA want their big stars to play in as many tournaments as possible. And so they've created this structure that you looked into that makes it mandatory to play certain things. And Taylor Fritz, in that tweet thread with Draper, actually said to someone that he's had to play basically every ATP 500, which is sort of like the 3rd tier. If you go Grand Slams being top tier, there's an ATP 1000s, which are the prestige non-slams, and then ATP 500 is the next level down. He said he had to play every single one of the ATP 500s after Wimbledon, otherwise he'd suffer ranking penalties. So they've obviously tried to compel the players to play a lot. And now playing a lot's a problem in tennis because you're traveling from the States to Asia, then you might have to go to the Middle East, then back to Asia. So it's not just playing, it's the travel burden, it's the psychological burden, it's the time, it's the jet lag. It's a pretty demanding way to make a living, actually. But then on the other side is the bit which maybe we'll discuss first, and that's is the nature of play changing because they've slowed the courts down and they've made the balls heavier. And the reason they would do that is because tennis that consists of big serve, no return, 5 times is not good fun to watch. And so 10-shot rallies that make it onto Instagram and YouTube and highlights reels is what organizers want. They want epic contests. And so I think there's pressure for the aesthetics and the spectacle to try and slow it down, to equalize and create drama. And I think that's the issue that Fritz is alluding to.
To slow it down, which creates longer rallies, which puts more pressure on the players' bodies overall, you mean?
Yeah, because you've got to run extra distance. You've got to if a rally's 6 shots longer, you've got to change direction 3 extra times. You've got to cover, and these are small margins, right? Like 4 extra meters per run, so that's 12 meters. But if you've got to do that over and over and over at that intensity, the fatigue on the joints, next thing, the load limit of the body's exceeded, and you've got a ruptured Achilles tendon, meet Holger Rune kind of thing. Now, what's interesting about this is that when Fritz says that, he's actually setting up a hypothesis, because he's setting up that he thinks that the combination of slower balls and heavier courts have have created a scenario where players have to play longer rallies. It's heavier, it's harder to win points. You can't hit through your opponent. The serve isn't as dominant. Now, you could use data to establish whether or not that is in fact true. And when you do that, and I don't think we've got the best source of data here, so that's a limitation. We'll state that up front. But the data doesn't seem to support that that's what's happening.
Look, if we've got something from a website called courtspeed.com, I'm telling you, this is good data. Because you found this, and this is fascinating because it shows the average rally length at the different tournaments, doesn't it?
Yeah, so I found this because someone had tweeted it in response to the Taylor Fritz thing as part of the support. So I opened it, thinking that what I was going to see was that rally length is going up and that ace rates are coming down and that the overall speed rating of these courts at different tournaments is dropping. But it actually isn't happening. So we'll put the link in the show notes, but like you're basically looking at a table of maybe a dozen or more tournaments over the years, and the data's a little bit thin. But for instance, you can click on a tab that says rally length, and you can see, for instance, that in Monte Carlo, the average rally length this year was 4.75 shots. In Rome, it was 4.65. But Rome's interesting because we can go all the way back to 2021. It goes 4.7, 4.5, 4.4, 4.6, 4.6. It's not different. It's the same as in, for instance, the Paris Masters tournament, where it's actually dropped. It used to be 4.5, then 4.2, then 4.1, then 3.8. So the data suggests that, if anything, the rally lengths are getting shorter.
Yep.
So I'm not really sure where the data is to support this. Out of interest, when I went down this rabbit hole, I discovered some things. Like, what do you think the most common rally length is?
4 seconds.
Shots. I think shots.
Oh, shots. So you've got to take into account that there's a fair few number of aces and balls that are just not returned well. 5.
1.
Really?
Yeah, because remember that
it's such a serve-heavy
an unreturned serve doesn't count towards the rally. So it depends on how you define it. So that's
one shot though.
So it's one successful shot, and then either it's an ace, which happens roughly 9-10% of the time, because on the same data source there's an ace rate, and so not surprisingly on the clay courts that ace rate is 6-7%. So that's 1 in 16 serves, whereas on the fast courts like Miami. If we go to Cincinnati, for instance, which is a hard court, Shanghai, which is indoors, it's about 12%, so it's 1 in 8. So globally, the average ace rate is probably 11%. 1 in 9 serves is an ace. But remember, a lot of times it's not an ace. The guy gets a racket to it, but it's not returned, so it's an error. That still counts as a one-shot rally because it's only one successful shot. So more than half of all rallies are one successful shot, because it is so serve heavy, and it drops off dramatically. So when I look at stats like this and they tell me the rally length in Monte Carlo is 4.8 or whatever it is, and in Paris it's 4.6, that's all good and well. But what I really want to know is what proportion of rallies are 3 shots and less, and what proportion of rallies are 8 shots or more, because then you're in a really lengthy rally, 8 shots or more. Now that's only about 1 in 10 rallies, I would have thought, if that. But maybe Taylor Fritz has got a point, because maybe the average isn't telling us the whole story here. And maybe what's happening over time is, if the serve is returned, then it becomes increasingly difficult to finish the point. And so we haven't seen a change in the average rally length, but maybe we're seeing 5% more rallies go to 8 shots or more. And then I can see that the players will feel that as wear and tear and fatigue and hard labor.
Yeah, well, yeah, because anecdotally, those epic matches we've been watching Alcaraz and Sinner this summer, so many of those rallies have been, perhaps it feels like a dozen shots. Perhaps that's just our perception of what we're watching, but they feel like they go on forever sometimes.
Yeah, and it might well be that those, and I found some reports. This was a little bit dated, so I didn't want to dwell on it too much. But if you go back, like in 2017, ATP 1000 final between Murray and Djokovic, 26% of their rallies were 10 shots or more. They played 50 points in that game, in that match, over 10 shots. Now, 0-3 was 38%. So the long rallies are still outnumbered by the short rallies. But it might be that what the players are talking about as longer rallies, heavier balls, slower courts, is manifesting as twice as many rallies beyond 10 shots, and that's gonna tell. So this could be a classic example of the average misleading us into thinking there's not a change, and I would love to see more granular detail on that to really know what's going on.
Well, the way I linked this in was it was something to do with money, because you mentioned earlier on that they have to play a certain number of games, and I'll just quickly fill in a bit of detail on that. The 4 Grand Slams, these are non-negotiable, it says, if you're healthy. Then you've got to play 8 mandatory ATP Masters 1000 tournaments. Then you've got to play at least 4 ATP 500 level events. You can choose which ones. You can't get away with skipping them if you want to get your points to add up. So there are mandatory tournaments, as you said. But when Taylor Fritz, he was talking about this, he was playing in a Six Kings exhibition match.
Yeah, it was a tournament.
In tournament, in the Middle East.
Yeah.
So he's there for the money.
The bank,
really.
The bank, as
he's
the
there
cool
for the
kids
bank.
say.
Alcaraz was there, and he said, and he defended his move to play in, as it says, the lucrative Saudi Arabia exhibition tournament. He says it's not really demanding mentally compared to when we have such long events like 2 weeks or 2.5 weeks. So, and Holger Rune, when he was injured, he was playing in the Stockholm Open, which is the lowest tier of ATP events, the ATP 250 event. He didn't really need to be there either. So you've got to pick and choose your battles. And if you're saying that you're being overworked, don't run off to the Middle East to take loads of money as well.
Well, this is the thing, right? And I mean, it came up even when we were discussing the rugby structure. You know, there's been this talk about a global calendar because the Six Nations is played February, March, and then the Rugby Championships is in June, July. It would make a lot more sense for all the global internationals to be played in the same window, because then you could structure your off-season more effectively. But and then off-seasons, like you should have a 6-week off-season. But everyone will say that there's always a price. You can do whatever you want if you pay enough. And I mean, you know, this Six Kings Slam, it was shown on Netflix. It was a Netflix production this year. It's the richest prize purse in tennis. The winner gets $4.5 million, which makes their total $6 million, because every one of the 6 participants was guaranteed 1.5 appearance fee. And then Sinner, who won it, would have banked another 4.5 bar. So it's hard to turn that down. So again, it's like the enhanced games, though. It's like, I understand the incentive. If I was the player, I'd also do it.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I'm not blaming them, but it does make it a bit rich then when you complain about being overworked while you're sleeping on a mattress full of cash.
Yeah, and Fritz was challenged on that, by the way, in his tweet thread. And he said, look, he sort of, to his credit, he fronts up and he responds to all these challenges. And he said something along the lines of, playing in an exhibition is much easier than in a tournament because you have a set start time. And you know, it's interesting, that one, players are allowed to do exhibitions, but this one's structured as a tournament. There's a qualifier, a semi-final, and a final, but you're not allowed to play 3 consecutive games, so they give them a rest day between day 2 and 4. So it's a 4-day tournament that's basically played out of Saudi. And so they found all the loopholes to pull it off. But I don't begrudge them that, and I do think the calendar needs to be maybe a little bit more flexible. But again, from the perspective of the ATP, it's their product. They're trying to manage tens of millions of dollars worth of sponsorships and all these stakeholders who run all the events that make up that tournament. They can't just have athletes going off to play exhibitions and never showing up to actual tournaments. So they have to pull them in.
Yeah.
So these load things
are a little bit harsh, but yeah, I wouldn't really. It stops them having to go to the enhanced games sooner or later. So.
These load discussions are so much more complicated than people realize, because it's the same with the rugby. It's like, how can you make these players play 30 matches a year? It should be 24. Well, you say, okay, you tell the player that. No way. The players are the ones who want to play more, just not when you want them to. It's a tough one.
Yeah. Little bit on doping. There was an article in the Telegraph. Thanks for Helen for spotting this one. Apparently 1 in 5 athletes sampled at the 2022 Commonwealth Games in Birmingham confessed to doping in the previous 12 months, according to an anonymous anti-doping survey. That's anonymous as in the results, or the questions were anonymous. 21% of more than 900 athletes answered yes to the question, I have intentionally used a prohibited substance or method without a TUE in the last 12 months. That's pretty damning, really.
Yeah.
And frightening.
Yeah, it is. I mean, just for some context to this is the latest iteration of a survey method that's been used in a couple of sports where they ask athletes to self-disclose doping use. And there was some controversy about this. It actually, back about 10 years ago, found its way into English Parliament. In fact, I found a document here. On the 8th of September 2015, UK Parliament actually held a hearing into a survey that was done back then, very similar to this. And what had happened back then was World Anti-Doping had commissioned a doping prevalence survey from a university in Germany. And these researchers in Germany had this survey method where instead of just going up to the athlete and saying, Fred, please say your name into the dictaphone and say yes or no, have you ever doped? Which no one would ever do, even an idiot. They basically designed the survey method that, quote unquote, guarantees anonymity in a way that's clear to the athlete. So the athlete or the player, whatever, is doing the survey, and it's meant to be very obvious to them that there will be no way to trace back who they are. Now, let's park that, because I know we both doubt that that's true in the mind of the athlete, even if it's academically true. And back in 2011, this study was done at 2 competitions. One was at the World Athletics Championships that were held in South Korea that year, and later on it was done at the Pan-Arab Games. And in the World Athletics Championships, the prevalence of doping, self-reported, was 29%. And at the Pan-Arab Games in Doha that year, it was 45%. So the paper came out, published by Rolf Ulrich, who I think was involved in this latest one, with a whole bunch of WADA names. But the controversy was that back then, the International Athletics Federation refused permission for them to publish it because the numbers were so damning. And so the University of Tübingen has been quoted on saying, and I'm reading the quote, "The IAAF's delaying publication for so long without good reason is a serious encroachment on the freedom of publication. The IAAF is blocking it." At the time, this made the New York Times, and it was a big story. And eventually, IAAF said, okay, go ahead, you can publish it. And the paper came out. And it's written pretty provocatively for an academic test. I'll read what they say. They say, "Here we show that doping among elite athletes is far more prevalent than suggested by biological testing. We surveyed 2,163 athletes at 2 major events using a specialized instrument that visibly guarantees confidentiality, thus encouraging truthful responses." And then they report the 29% and the 45%. Later on, these findings demonstrate that doping is remarkably widespread among elite athletes and remains largely unchecked despite current biological testing programs. So the IAAF's reluctance to let it be published might have something to do with the somewhat flowery language that was used in the actual academic paper. But anyway, it made its way out there. And that was 10 years ago, and I haven't seen it repeated often enough because it's actually quite important knowledge to have. This stat.
Yeah, I was just reading, it says, in all 3 studies, athletes were asked about their involvement in doping, as well as innocuous exam-style questions, which are used to guarantee their anonymity and make the process feel less stressful. The technique is designed to disinhibit the human instinct to deny wrongdoing. Results are generated as estimates because it's unlikely that every subject has responded honestly.
Yeah.
It sounds a bit sort of airy-fairy to me.
Yeah, look, I mean, there's an extreme. The furthest extreme is, Gareth, please write your name on the paper and tick the box, yes or no, have you ever doped? No one's ever going to do that, like no athlete in the world. You can generate codes and you can guarantee an anonymity and so on, but I don't fully understand qualitative surveys type research enough to give you the details on this. But this is a method that is meant to be much better at guaranteeing that the athlete will give you a truthful answer. Yeah. But there's no way that it's 100% true. And many athletes, the moment they know that there's a doping question, they're just going to say no. It doesn't matter how you pad it, they are not going to admit to doping. So if the figure coming out of Great Britain's 21%, did you mention Spain 36%?
No, I didn't mention the 2 countries. I wasn't going to throw mud, but no, you just have, yeah.
So the same survey gets done in Spanish athletes, and it's 36%. We'll get to what that difference means in a moment. But that will be the lowest possible prevalence of doping. You can't go lower than that because you're
not going to say you would, yeah.
Yeah, 21% of people have told you they did it in Great Britain, and 36% of Spanish athletes have said they did it. You can't now go and say, how many athletes do you think are doping? Oh, about 10%. No, they've told you that it's 21 and 36% themselves. So if you only believe human nature, you have to put your lowest estimate at 21% in England and 36% at Spain.
Right. Okay. Yeah. It was the lowest estimate was 15% in Britain. They think it was 21,
But that's
and
just
the upper estimate is
yeah, but
27.
that's just confidence around the estimate. The actual
It's
it's 21, give or take.
15% is still shocking. 15% of athletes, the
Right.
lowest possible, are
Yeah.
doping.
Yeah. So yeah. Okay. So now in Spain it's 36%. So you could say one of two things. Either both those countries' athletes are equally honest in the survey, and there are genuinely 15% more athletes in Spain that dope, or the English just don't tell you as much as the Spanish do about doping.
It's better liars.
That's what I think. I'm going for the latter.
Okay. Right. One very, very,
But
very last.
sorry, guys. Just
Go on.
on that, the reason surveys like this matter is because they do establish that theoretical base prevalence of doping. And then what you need to be able to say is, well, okay, testing catches 1%. So per 100 samples taken from elite athletes, only 1% is positive. But you know that 20%, 30% of athletes are telling you that they've doped in the last 12 months. That difference, the 30% that you're self-confessing and the 1% that you're catching, is the ineffectiveness of anti-doping. Now, that's being a little bit uncharitable, because anti-doping isn't collecting a sample every single day, and the athlete might have doped on the 16th of March 2025 for a week and they weren't tested then, but it's still telling you that there's a problem that anti-doping is not catching, because its success rate is way lower than the self-confessed prevalence. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I remember you on a podcast years ago, probably like 2019, 2020. I think it was Dick Pound, the ex-Olympic chief. Was he the Olympic chief?
WADA president.
British.
He was the WADA
Yeah,
man.
WADA president.
Canadian, yeah.
Yeah. He said it was about 10%. They thought that 10% of athletes doped. So nothing's really changed. In fact, it might have even gone up according to these figures.
Maybe, you see, and maybe it's 10% at any given time. But in fact, it's probably not even that. But in that survey, it was 21% in the last year. Now that might mean I doped in March, but not April, May, June, and then I might have used some again in October, or August rather, and then I stopped in September. So what's the true its annual prevalence is 21%, but maybe at any given moment or at any given championship, there are 10% of athletes who would fail a test if they were all sampled.
Kind of depressing, though.
Yeah, it is. I mean, and this is why people say, oh, sports really changed and it's much cleaner now. 2011 survey was 29% in the World Athletics Championships. Now it's 22 and 36%. It's no different. So the self-confessed doping number is the same today as it was 14 years ago. So
You know what cheers me up, though?
What cheers you up?
The clown show that the UCI is. The UCI now. Have you seen this? The UCI and ketones.
Yeah, I saw the headline, and I know you posted something on it in Discourse.
Yeah, it came from Renato, actually. UCI have recommended against the use of legal ketone supplements. They say, as there is no compelling evidence that ketone supplements enhance performance or recovery, the UCI sees no reason for them to be used. Therefore, the UCI does not recommend the inclusion of supplements in riders' nutritional plans. And why did they bother releasing a statement?
When I read that sentence on Discourse and I saw UCI believes there's no benefit to their use, so therefore there's no reason to, I read it as ban them.
Yeah.
And I had to do a double take to say, oh, they're not saying we're not going to ban it because it doesn't work. We're saying it shouldn't be used because it doesn't work. It's like, that's not your problem.
Yeah. Why even say anything? It's just bizarre.
Yeah, like it's not for the UCI to be the moral guardian of behavior in its maybe you could argue it is actually, but it would be unprecedented for them to issue what's basically nutritional advice.
Well, it is essentially, isn't it? It's like saying, don't use pickle juice. We don't think it works.
Yeah, 10 grams an hour is all
benefit.
you need. Imagine the UCI come out next week and say, we've seen this paper by Noakes and we reckon 10 grams an hour carbs is all you need, cyclists. Crack on. That's what this is basically doing.
I thought it was a quick one just to throw in, because mathematics last statement made me laugh. He said, no study has ever convinced me that something worked quite as much as this announcement.
Yeah, that's the problem. And I mean, look, ketones is an interesting one, and it's come up, there's a thread on Discourse on it for those who want to go and read up what very well-informed, interested, motivated people are saying. But the fact that it's still in use a decade after it was first used suggests to me that it's got staying power. Well, it has staying power. And the fact that it's got staying power suggests to me that it's got benefit. And just because lab studies are not finding it doesn't mean it's not there. So it's an interesting move. Why? What's the gain of saying that? You're not going to discourage people from doing it. If anything, you're going to drive more people to do it. And you've clearly painted yourself into a corner that you can't ban it because it's not performance enhancing by your own words.
So you told you the chewy up.
So now what? I don't know.
Okay.
It would be an interesting one to understand the rationale behind.
Yeah, right. Let's move on from the news. It's taken a little bit longer than I thought, but we'll get on to center stage, and this should be a good one today, because this is all about the interference effect. Now, the only interference I know really from sport is like pass interference in American football, but this is more about the old endurance versus strength debate, and whether or not one affects the other, either positively or negatively. So I came across a paper called Power and Endurance, Polar Opposites or Willing Partners. And it was a really interesting read. And as soon as I showed it to you, you said, this is definitely one for Spotlight. So we'll kick it off. They say that the principle of specificity, you know I can't say that word, is a critical component of any training program that aims to bring about physiological adaptations to enhance performance of explicit exercise tasks. The paper argues that that principle has contributed to an oversimplified view of the mediators of exercise performance, and that the interplay between peak neuromuscular power and endurance ability in determining exercise performance is more nuanced. So what do they mean by that?
A lot of syllables, academic writing.
It is. Academic writing.
So what they mean by that is, and this whole concept, and their title is good. I quite like the title of this paper. I thought it was a useful way to frame it. It's power and endurance, polar opposites or willing partners. And the whole principle is that when I'm training for power, I'm on the opposite end of the spectrum in terms of what I want to get out compared to when I'm training for endurance. One of those is concerned with muscle strength, maybe muscle hypertrophy, as in bigger muscles. It's concerned with very short, high force production, whereas endurance is going long, hours, not seconds. And so you put yourself on what you can visualize to be two ends, opposite ends rather, of what are two extremes. And that's why when we talk about training specificity, we typically used to think like you train for power or you train for endurance. And in their title, they're asking the question, is that dichotomy necessary? Are they really polar opposites, or are they partners, which implies that they are locked together? And the whole sentence you've just spoken about there is that their argument is that this overplaying of training specificity has forced us to oversimplify to the extent that we've put endurance in a silo of its own, and we've put power and strength training in a silo of its own in a way that they don't interact with one another, and if anything, they might cancel one another out. And they're saying that based on what we know now, there's an interplay, a link between those two different training types that actually is more nuanced than had previously been thought. So if we were to simplify this, the problem definition is, can I train for two things at the same time, or do they cancel one another out and undermine the benefits I get from one or the other or both? Does that make sense? That's setting up the problem. And what they're going to do is they're going to talk to you about why that theory exists, where it came from, what it used to be thought of, and what the latest evidence is.
So in YouTube speak, is cardio killing my gains?
That's exactly what it is. That's the reason so many weightlifting types are allergic to a treadmill, is because on Instagram they'll see someone saying, here's the main thing you should avoid when you go to the gym. Don't do cardio because it's going to kill your gains, exactly as you said.
Now, they launch straight into the science, and I know you just wanted to touch on this because they look at the different types of motor units recruited, and this is quite key and important to the science behind it, is it not?
Yeah, so part of the reason for the specificity thinking is that when you do certain tasks, as in heavy weightlifting, high power, explosive, plyometric, jumping, bounding, etc., that's on the one end of the spectrum, as opposed to endurance type training, repeating the same task over and over and over, but lower intensity, you activate different muscle fibers. So there's a concept of motor unit recruitment, that you recruit them in order of size, but the ones you recruit first for low intensity work are your sort of type 1 oxidative fibers, and then later on you recruit the type 2 fibers, the glycolytic ones that are in theory more forceful, able to produce more power, but they fatigue quicker. So that's part of where training specificity comes from. Now, it's a little more complex than that, as it always is, because you do recruit all the muscle fibers irrespective of what you're doing, just maybe in different proportions. But the main thing is that they come with different molecular and metabolic consequences, because when we activate and do high intensity strength type training, lifting weights, particularly heavy weights, the signals at the molecular level that are sent and created are different to the signals that are, this is the theory, right? This is the theory of interference, are different from the signals that are sent when we do endurance exercise. So, in fact, those of you watching on YouTube, I'm just putting this up to make a point. That's the kind of thing that molecular physiologists and biologists will put together. It's this really remarkable, it's one of the coolest things in all of science, I think, is how a signal becomes an adaptation. Because I'm contracting the muscle, I'm using ATP, I'm loading the muscle fibers. That triggers this crazy complex cascade of one molecule that tells another molecule to tell another molecule to tell another molecule to do something. And eventually, like 20 steps later, something is activated, and then you get something in the DNA, and you get gene expression, and eventually proteins. Hey presto, bigger muscles. Or, hey presto, more mitochondria for endurance exercise, or whatever your outcome of interest is. So it's called the signaling cascades. Does this make sense to you? Is that you have an initial signal, and then a whole crazy complex sequence of things that goes on from there all the way to the end, and the end result is proteins formed, and that's what adaptation looks like.
Yeah, I've always wondered about that sort of what actually happens when you lift a weight. How does that make any difference whatsoever? And I mean, and so really that's the molecular level of that old, you break muscle down and it rebuilds stronger, is that?
Yeah, and it's even before it's broken down. Like the signals to start driving muscle adaptation exist simply because of mechanical tension in the muscle before damage, before breakdown. In consequence, or in response rather, to the consequence of muscle contraction is the consumption of ATP. You produce ADP, AMP, phosphates, hydrogen ions. Those metabolic byproducts of exercise, if you can call them that, they all drive these signals. And the key bit in this interference argument is that when we do endurance exercise, remember the main thing with endurance is muscle contraction over and over and over. We have to burn ATP, that's our energy currency. As we do that, we cause the activation of a signaling cascade that involves a molecule called AMP kinase. Don't worry about these details. You can read it up if you'd like later. But that activates a signal cascade that eventually drives all those adaptations. This came up when we spoke to Brendan Gerd about Zone 2 training. All those adaptations that eventually give us more mitochondria, more capillaries, greater lung capacity, etc. They're all driven by those signals. On the other hand, when we train at the other extreme, short, high-intensity, power, strength type stuff, the main protagonist is a molecule called mTOR. It's the muscle target of rapamycin, if memory serves me. And that's a little signaling molecule that's responsible for driving protein synthesis in the muscle. Now, the reason that physiologists thought for a long time that endurance training would compromise strength gains was because that AMP kinase that's activated when we burn ATP and convert it to AMP and ADP, that activates something else that actually inhibits mTOR. So you can almost think of it as two light switches. Imagine you've got a room with two light switches, but they couldn't both be on at the same time. The moment you put the endurance one on, it switched the resistance one off. And so that's what the interference was conceptualized as. And it came from molecular work and work that was done in rodents. And the theory grew that if you had this AMPK kinase active, that's tautology, AMP kinase active, you would switch off muscle growth and hypertrophy because that pathway switched off the one that was running alongside it. Is this making sense without
Yeah,
being
that's
overwhelmingly
interesting. Yeah,
complex?
that's a good analogy. I like that one.
Yeah, so it's like, to what extent, and maybe they're not light switches, maybe they're dimmer switches, but
Yeah.
they couldn't both be on a 10. And so this guy, I think it was Atherton, did this mouse research and so on. He was saying, if you're going to both on 5, and I now turn up the endurance one to 8, 9, 10, the muscle hypertrophy, the mTOR one's going to go down to 2 or 3 because the one inhibits the other.
And
And
it might even be that then when you turn that strength one back on, it can't go as bright because you've actually damaged its ability.
Yeah, you've inhibited basically what that mTOR can do, because these signaling pathways, you've basically put a barrier in the way of the signaling pathway by blocking mTOR. And you can look it up, and it's basically AMP kinase activates something called TSC. Don't ask me to tell you what that one means. And TSC inhibits the mTOR. So that was always the theory. And there were some studies, like in 1980, there was a study by a guy called Hickson, where they basically made 3 groups of athletes do training. One was a strength group, one was an endurance group, and one was a group that did both at the same time. So strength group was 5 days a week. It was stuff like squats, knee flexion, knee extension, calf raises, leg press. The endurance group basically did interval sessions on a bike, and then they did some running sessions for 30, 40 minutes a day, 5 to 6 days a week. And in the concurrent group, you got the short straw. You did both at the same time. So that's a tough training week for you. And basically what they found was that the strength group got 40% stronger over the course of 10 weeks. The endurance group got 3% stronger. So that's logical, right? Like, you train for strength, you get stronger. The endurance group got 3% because you didn't train for it. So why would it change at all? 3%, nothing. But the group that did both peaked at 35, but ended the 10 weeks at 24. And so they said, well, what this is showing us is that if I add endurance to strength work, I don't get as strong. And that's kind of like entrenched the fear of the treadmill that persists to this day among some of the big boys who train in the gym.
Mm-hmm. So things have changed slightly with a paper in 2016 by Murach and Bagley. And the conclusions from their analysis at the time were there was no evidence in the literature to support the interference effect of endurance training on hypertrophic adaptations to resistance training, at least in untrained individuals. In fact, in most instances, the opposite was observed. And as I noted here, I said, am I actually reading this right?
Yeah.
There's no evidence for interference on hypertrophy, but there is for peak power.
Yeah, so it's almost in a way a bit anticlimactic and disappointing, because that model of 2 switches that are interacting and one's blocking the other is actually quite cool and elegant. It's quite a nice one to work with. But here's the punchline, folks, is that in the real world, it doesn't seem to happen that way. And I think what's changed, since the 1980s and the early 90s, when theories like the interference model were created, admittedly with very sophisticated molecular methods, is that we've now got even better stuff. Like, now you can measure gene expression, like instantly. You can measure the levels of AMPK and so on. And two of the main reasons that theory that we've just explained to you doesn't seem to apply is, number one, mTOR, which is the muscle protein synthesis mediator, and AMP kinase, which is the endurance mediator, have completely different life cycles. AMP kinase is up and down really, really quickly in response to changes in ATP and phosphate levels. So when you exercise, its levels, ATP levels obviously drop because you're using it, and AMP kinase is active. The moment you stop, it starts to drop off really fast. mTOR lasts a lot longer. And so theoretically, it's possible that AMP kinase does block mTOR, but in reality, they're basically never in the same room together, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. So those 2 switches that could interfere with one another, they're never next to each other, except in very unusual circumstances. And so more often than not, someone will not see suppression of protein development, hypertrophy, synthesis, gene expression as a result of endurance training, unless their AMP kinase levels are so active at exactly the moment that they do their strength type training. And that's where your exception comes in. So it is possible that you can compromise power output training and neuromuscular adaptations as a consequence of endurance if you do it close enough that AMP kinase can inhibit the mTOR. Does that make sense?
Hmm. So close enough in time, you mean?
Yeah,
What
close
sort of
enough in
time scales are we
proximity.
talking about?
Three,
Days?
no,
Hours?
hours, yeah. And so people who need to do both types of training, and there are some, they talk in the paper about rowers, for instance, you need
Hmm.
strength and endurance. The recommendation is that you do the strength training 3 hours or 3 to 6 hours apart or away, separate from whatever you know what I mean, from the
Yeah.
endurance training. And if you have to do them in the same session, that you do the resistance training first, so that you activate mTOR, and then you follow it up with the AMP kinase second, and not the other way around, because then you might reduce or downregulate the activation of the mTOR. So that's the advice. But the other thing to think about here is that most of us are not training at anything like the levels that we would need to train to maximize those signal cascades and pathways and therefore adaptations to training. So for me, if I go to the gym and do some weightlifting and then I spend 9 or 10 hours on the bike, I'm not close to either ceiling, and there won't be any interference even possible. And in fact, one of the things that this study says, and it's maybe the most important one, is that when you measure the genes that are being expressed, so this is the key, right? If you don't express different genes after training, you're not adapting. 60%
So
of the genes. Sorry, we're going to ask something.
how do you mean expressing genes? Sorry.
Well, you've got obviously you've got your DNA, which
Hmm.
contains all the genetic information, particularly for the. I'm using lots of jargon, and I apologize. DNA tells the body which proteins it can make, but it needs a signal to tell it which ones need to be made at that time. So the signal comes from exercise, and then the DNA says, okay, we've got the code, we can make that, we've got the recipe book, as it were, to make that specific set of proteins. We've just received an instruction, let's make it, and that's gene expression. So you've got the genes, and the question is, are you expressing them? Are you cooking that particular recipe at that moment in time? Does that answer your question?
Right. Okay. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, a lot of jargon here. Apologies. So you can look at all the genes that are currently in the kitchen, as it were, the ones that are activating their recipes, and 60% of those genes are the same, irrespective of whether you did a strength power session or an endurance session. And so it tells you that far from being silos for power and endurance, most of what we do actually overlaps quite a lot. And it's only when we get very specialized and as close to the muscle strength, hypertrophy, power, endurance ceiling that we can no longer rely on overlap, and we have to be very specific. And that should make sense, hopefully, to people.
Okay. I've got to ask. That 60% then, if it's not endurance and it's not power, what is it? Is it
It's
fitness? Is it?
it's stress response. It's a stress response. It's an adaptation to stress, and the stress is not specific. So whether the stress of training is lifting weights, or whether it is running VO2 max repeats around a track for 4 minutes at a pop, or whatever the case is, the body is seeing generic stress. Now, some of that stress is specific, some of that stress is not, and a lot of it, according to that particular findings, is not specific. So the body mounts a response in terms of its genetic its expression, let's call it. It's going to make new proteins that make us more robust in response to that stress. And that stress is overlapping the same, irrespective of whether that stress was applied to us during a strength training session or an endurance training session. Now, this is not to say that you can prepare for your next marathon or 10K by spending all your time lifting weights in the gym, because that's the part that's specific. You still need to do the run. But the point is that it's not so different that you have to pick one or the other. You're getting some benefit and no or minimal interference as a consequence of doing either or.
So cross training really does work, because I know we had a conversation before about cycling and running and whether cycling can prepare you for running. And so that 40%, so you're getting that 60% cycling, and then say you're running for the other 40, that's strengthening the tendons and making sure your knees don't go, things like that. And that's the specifics you need. So that's really interesting, actually, because it goes to show that strength training really does help with your endurance work. And they actually say here, I think it was, they say, therefore it appears that a training regime in which approximately 25% of the total sessions consist of resistance training is advantageous for endurance performance. So you spend 25% of your time on the strength, and it's not going to be impacting on your running.
Yeah. I mean, all the way we framed it so far in this conversation is, does the endurance training have a negative impact on the strength training? And the answer to that is not nearly as much as you think, maybe in some very special circumstances, but in general, very minimal. But in the other direction, there's almost no downside, only potential upside, and as you mentioned, probably benefit. The only constraint in that direction, does my resistance training affect endurance, is, do I have the time and the energy to pull off all of them? Because there's an opportunity cost, like if I'm saying I'm going to do 3 sessions a week of weight training, that's potentially 3 sessions a week, not running, cycling, and so on. So can you add them and do 12 a week, or do you have to pick or choose? That's just an opportunity cost question at that point.
But the thing, it's lifestyle. You can tick over in the winter. Things like that. You can just integrate it that way, can't you? And it's not doing any harm, is the beauty.
Exactly. And for me, that's part of the positive take home of the study, not the study, the review article, which again is open access, so you'll all be able to read it. Tell us if we think we framed anything incorrectly. But the point is that no time is wasted. You're not cancelling out. The 10 hours a week that you do of X doesn't diminish the value of the 4 hours a week you do of Y. If anything, they add a little bit to one another. They potentiate one another. They support one another. And so we can answer the question that's asked in the title: are they polar opposites or are they willing partners? And the answer is the latter. And it's the reason it's the latter is because this crazy complexity of all these signaling pathways, they all kind of converge on the same point, and they give us adaptations that don't actually cancel one another out. They're sort of all hands on deck, pulling the same rope, not in exactly the same direction. Again, I don't want to make this sound, we positioned that Zone 2 podcast maybe a little bit imprecisely, and this is not saying the same thing like that was saying, where you're saying, oh, you know what, you don't need to do the endurance work, and it's not saying that. You still do. There is still a concept of training specificity, but I think you can overplay what it means and then ignore things that are actually beneficial to you because you think they're bad for you. And that's what you shouldn't do.
Fascinating.
That's a really
so you're
cool,
not,
interesting
you're not killing
paper.
your gains.
No, unless you are literally at the point of, you're so close to your own ceiling that your body is pretty much right up against its limits for protein synthesis. You're doing everything possible, because protein synthesis, muscle building, let's call it in lay terms, is a consequence of that balance between protein breakdown and protein synthesis, and anabolic versus catabolic. And I think at some point there, if you did endurance training that even slightly diminished the protein synthesis pathways via the blocking of that mTOR, you probably come off that ceiling. Now you're at 92%, and then you start saying, hey, I'm shrinking here, which you're not. But so at that level, yes. But for everyone else, just embrace the fact that these training types, they don't achieve the same thing, but they complement one another more than you think, and they don't undermine one another as much as you think.
Mm-hmm. And there's also this injury prevention that comes into it. Things like that.
If you're doing 20 hours a week on the bike, or even 10 hours a week running, I reckon you can't afford, especially as you get older, you can't afford not to do resistance training, because everything else in our lives just makes us so weak. You have to reinvest some strength work.
Mm-hmm. Right. That's quite fascinating, and well done for getting through with all those.
Yeah, there was a lot of jargon there. I hope it.
Always
There's a lot of assumed knowledge, which I hope makes sense. Whatever's not explained there will be explained in Discourse, which is another punt to pledge us a monthly, buy us a cup of coffee a month, and you can read it all.
Speaking of which, we're going to go back to the listener lens about the Andrew Feather podcast, because one of the comments on it came from Ali, and Ali actually he or she, I'm not sure. I've been fortunate to coach several national hill climb champions and podium finishers over the years. So when they posted about Andrew Feather, we took note, because it was an absolutely fantastic post, where he's combined, he or she again, combined information from the podcast and various videos on the internet, and has worked out some of the stats, I think, around Andrew. Now, obviously, I'm not sure how close they are to the truth, but I know you were particularly fascinated But you wanted to start off, you wanted to explain the concepts of W prime and CP before we even start, didn't you?
Yeah, so this was I think Ali mentioned in one of his posts, and I'm saying his because I'm fairly certain of this, that some of the local comms around where Ali lives were Andrew Feathers, and Ali took them off him. So first of all, Ali must be a good coach, and secondly, Ali's not a guy you want to challenge to a hill climb because he's not, I wouldn't say he's Andrew Feather level, but he's taken some comms off Feather, so he's got some watts. But I thought it was a fabulous post, because it's cool when someone listens to what one of our guests is saying and then finds a hidden side of things, and I was kicking myself for not bringing it up while we spoke to him. But let's do that. So CP, critical power, can be defined as the sort of maximal power you can sustain for a prolonged period before fatigue kicks in. So and there are a few different ways you can think of it. It's often spoken of as similar or analogous to maximal lactate steady state, to the FTP. Basically, think of it as like your 1 hour power output, right? At that power output, you're working really hard, but sustainably. If you went above that, you would no longer be in the sustainable training zone. You'd be in the very severe training zone, and fatigue would be the inevitable outcome. Whether that happens in a few seconds or a few minutes or 30 minutes is a function of how much you go above that. That makes sense, right? So you could have, and Andrew Feather mentioned, he hinted at it on the podcast. There's also a GCN video where they talk about he's got a critical power of 400 watts. So that's the number that Ali used in the Discourse post. W prime is really interesting because that's your anaerobic capacity. Now, anaerobic means no oxygen, so more accurately these days we talk about it as oxygen independent. In other words, that's metabolism that allows you to produce energy, ATP, without needing oxygen to be involved in the process. So it's glycolysis. It's that carbohydrate broken down to a molecule whose name is pyruvate, converted to lactate, and in that process, 2 ATPs are formed. And that's what short duration athletes are relying on. 400 meters, 800 meters, 1500 meter athletes. Andrew Feather, when he's whacking a 2-minute hill climb at 650 watts, which is the other number that Ali used in his story. So that's anaerobic capacity, and you can quantify that as work because it's literally got a kilojoule value that you can assign to it. And so that's called W prime. I don't know how these things got their names. You could come up with better names for them. But anyway, W prime, one way to think about it is a battery. It's a capacity to do work above critical power. So at critical power, no problem. The moment you go above critical power, you start eating into this battery. Where this analogy falls down a little bit is the thing that's going to cause fatigue in the end is not depletion. It's actually accumulation of hydrogen ions and phosphates and ADP and AMP. So a battery makes me think of I'm burning something up. But in actual fact, this is almost like a storage container where you can put more of that stuff. And the bigger that container is, the more you can put into it before you actually fail.
How about a balloon? How about an empty balloon? And when you go above, you start filling the balloon, and eventually it's going to pop.
Good, great. Let's go with that then. That's cool. So, and some people have a small balloon, and some people have a really big one. And Ali's point was that using the numbers that we know from Feather, from GCN video on him, and what he told us in that podcast, you can work out that Andrew Feather's balloon is 30,000 joules large. Now, the way you do this, incidentally, is pretty easy to do, is you take your critical power, say 300 watts. Let's use easy numbers. No, let's use Andrew Feather's numbers, because then people can go on Discourse and confirm. 400 watts, right? So Andrew Feather's got 400 watts at critical power. He also told us that he can do 650 watts for 2 minutes, which is 120 seconds. So what's the difference between that power output and his critical? It's 650 minus the 450. You with me?
Mm-hmm. 400.
650 minus 400. My apologies. So that's 250. So for 2 minutes, for 120 seconds, Andrew Feather is operating at 250 watts above his critical power. So he is eating, and remember, a watt is a joule per second. So Andrew Feather is filling his balloon. I was going to say eating into his battery, but I forgot we've got a better analogy now.
We've got a balloon.
Andrew Feather is filling his balloon at a rate of 250 joules every second, and we know that he will fail after 120 seconds. So 250 multiplied by 120 gives us what Ali calculated as 30,000 joules. That makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. So he's now filled his balloon. That's it. He could do no more.
And then bang, he's going to fall over.
Yeah.
Now, okay, but maybe he can. Maybe next time he races, he can.
You don't catastrophically just stop, do you?
No, you don't. But that's
you crack.
That's what
on a race you'd crack, wouldn't you?
Yeah, exactly. And if Andrew Feather had to ride for 2 minutes and he tried to go 680 watts instead of 650, he would now be at 280 watts more than his critical power. So he would be filling his balloon at 280 joules every second. But because his balloon is only 30,000 joules large, he's going to fill it after 107 seconds. But he had to go 2 minutes. So those last 13 seconds, what's going to happen? He's slowing down. And the thing is, because of pacing, which we've spoken about before, he's slowing down long before that, because all the signals are saying, like, my God, what are you doing, Andrew? You're killing us here. So he's going to slow down before he gets to the point of the balloon popping or cracking.
Unless you know the lines there. Anticipatory regulation.
Anticipatory regulation. But the mistake that this hypothetical Andrew Feather has made is he's gone 680, not 650, and the line is now 13 seconds further away than his brain thought it was. So that would represent a pacing mistake. And I think one of the things about this doubly prime concept is that you can understand pacing mistakes by using it. So the way you would use this, let's take you, for example. We're going to take your critical power of 265. You would now go on Zwift, and it's easiest to do on Zwift because you can control the watts like almost, in fact, you can use the erg mode to set it exactly. So I would give you the challenge of, I'm going to say, Gareth, I want you to go at 350 watts and 500 watts for as long as you can. It's a horrible test to do because it's literally a test to exhaustion.
So 2 separate tests. One at 350, one at 500.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm making these numbers up as we go. This might not be the most appropriate. But the 350 is going to put you at 85 joules per second faster than your critical power, higher than your critical power. The 500 is going to put you at 235 joules per second greater than your critical power. And what we want to know is, how long does it take for your balloon to pop?
So say it's a minute then.
So let's say that at 500 watts you can do 60 seconds. Okay. Okay. Yeah. Let's say that. Let's be ambitious. Let's say that you can do 500 watts for 60 seconds. You are 235 joules per second above critical power, so you are filling your balloon at a rate of 235 joules per second, and you're doing that for 60 seconds before you fail. My calculation is telling me that your W prime is 14,100 joules.
Yeah, sounds about right.
Now, if you now filled that 14,100 joule balloon at 85 joules faster than your critical power, my estimate is that you're going to make 2 minutes and 45 seconds riding at 350 watts.
That's quite handy, actually.
It's really cool, because once you understand this, you can use it for once-off efforts. As long as you've got an idea of how long the duration needs to be, you can sort of estimate where I need to go out at in order to pace it correctly. And you can also use it for interval training, because when you structure an interval session, like let's say now we said, let's say we're going to make you go 320 watts. The estimate based on this would be so 320 is going to be, you're going to be filling your balloon at 55 joules per second, and based on your 14,000 joule balloon, that's going to be 4 minutes 20. So we can now design an interval session where we say, right, Gareth, you're going to do 320 watts. Based on the numbers, we think that you're going to pop. Your balloon is popping after 4 minutes 20. So we're going to do 3 minutes at 320 watts, but we can repeat it 5 times with a recovery period in between. And that's going to be a really nice training dose for to work at a solid tempo into that anaerobic zone. We could do the same at 600 watts, at which stage we're massively consuming filling your balloon, as it were, because that's 335 joules per second filling it up, and our prediction is that you'll only have that for 42 seconds. So if we did an interval session of 600 watts, we have to be real careful. We can only do 15, 20 seconds of those at a time. Otherwise, we're going to kill you in 2 reps.
It's a little bit more precise and finesse than just getting your FTP and saying it, hold that for X amount of that, isn't it?
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
a bit more tailored.
I think it's a great tool to use. And Ali, those of you on Discourse, those of you not, get on. You can see exactly how Ali suggests you use it for races and for interval training. I'm a big fan, actually. I used to, when I started doing more interval type stuff on the indoor bike, I used to use it all the time. The tricky thing and the limitation to it, lest we delve or drift into bro science, is it's obviously highly individual. So what your W prime and your critical power determine your capacities. I'll have a different combination of those two things. Andrew Feather's got like a crazy combination of those things. So would Pogacar. By the way, like a sprinter like a Jasper Philipsen or Tim Merlier would have relatively low critical power because they're not great for an hour, but their W prime will be enormous because they are so good for 45 seconds, way above critical power. They can do 1,000 watts for like a period of time, and they'll be 650 watts above their own critical power for 45 seconds. Mad numbers. And it's because they've got these enormous anaerobic capacity engines, as it were. Like their balloons are hot air balloons.
You know, when you're recovering, so you're emptying your balloon then, aren't you?
Yeah, exactly. Because you filled it up now by going above critical power.
So you can recharge. You obviously recharge it, but you can't get it completely empty.
Yeah, and that's called the W prime balance. And so every time in a race, you let's say you're cruising along at critical power, then you shift because you go up a hill or there's an attack. You start filling your balloon. You start the moment you go down the hill on the next side, the attack, the pressure comes off the pedals. That balloon starts to empty, and it never restores to its complete value, because if it did, theoretically you could keep going forever. You'd never fatigue, right? And we know that doesn't happen. So it doesn't fully return in the same session to what it always was. So like if your W prime was 14,100, after your first rep, maybe we're gonna bring it down to let's say we did that. We made you do that session of 320 watts times 4 minutes. So that's 240 seconds multiplied by the difference between your wattage and your critical power. We're going to use up 13,000 of your maybe that's a little bit ambitious. Let's say we make you go at 300 watts instead. We're going to use up 8,400 of your 14,000 units. So we're going to fill up 8,400 of your 14.
And
then when you recover for the next 3 minutes before your second rep, that W prime, that balloon, starts to go back up to 14,000. It won't get there. It'll be 13.8 or something maybe. But then you can hit the second rep and the third rep and the fourth rep, etc., until your session is finished.
It helps you, as Ali actually says, in the real world, it helps you develop a precise feel for the effort. So I was thinking about this in the real world. You've got to know how long you can go to the top of that hill and how much you can give. And yeah,
exactly. And it's handy because I found I'd like to think that I'm quite good at pacing. But when it comes to pacing sprint efforts, it's hard. And the consequence of mispacing a sprint is really bad because you fall off a cliff. If you mispace a marathon, okay, it can also be really bad, as we discovered last week. But you can make adjustments. There's time. Whereas if you're doing, like I say, a 90-second hill, and I started it at 650, 700 watts, I'm going to be 280 watts at the top. I'll be below critical power because I would have completely filled my balloon. It would have burst, and I still got to do 150 meters. So it definitely helps you calibrate those high-intensity efforts as you learn your own ceilings. So a highly useful thing to do. And by the way, like if you're still with us as a non-cyclist, well done. There is a running equivalent to this as well, because in running, it's not critical power, it's critical speed, and it's not W prime, it's called D prime, and it's literally distance. So a runner can do the same thing, and they can say my critical speed might be 4 meters per second, which is just outside 4 minutes a K, right? And my D prime might be 250 meters. And you can use exactly the same calculation that we've spoken about now to work out how long you could go at different speeds faster than your critical speed. And tell you what, like we'll put it on Discourse. I'll go and post an example of it on Discourse underneath Ali's post. Maybe you can spin a new thread off, and we'll post some examples of this, because I just think it's a really cool tool to start the process of understanding where's my capacity when I'm above critical power. Because we spend so much time talking about critical power, endurance, etc., but actually, like, to race and to perform well, even if you just want to give your mates a whack on your social ride on the weekend, this is the stuff that makes the difference, and this is how you learn about it.
Yeah. So thanks, Ali, for that. That was an excellent post on Discourse. And
yeah, really good.
Apologies for me completely failing to assume your gender.
Yeah, sorry, go on.
And then I was just going to say, I was just going to set something up with our and finally. Actually, I'm just going to set up next week's possible topic.
Yeah, it's your turn. It's your turn today. But since yours is actually the and finally, I've got two quick ones. First of all,
go ahead.
I know you'll be delighted to learn that the Cricket World Cup for women is into its final throws.
I haven't seen the score.
Must be, and it's not the final today. It's Australia playing England in the round robin. But I must be honest. Since we spoke about it, I find it really hard to follow and get interested in cricket of any kind. I've barely watched a ball of this tournament.
No, I've been following England, but it looks like I'm not going to be following them much longer. Just reading the headline now.
They're qualified for the semis. They lost to Australia today.
They've just lost to Australia. Yeah.
Australia are the women's England team of women's cricket. No.
Yeah.
I think
analogy.
I think I really balls.
Thank God nobody's listening still.
But you know what I mean. Like they seem borderline invincible. They're an astonishing team. They didn't even have their main player in the squad today, and they won it pretty comfortably. Anyway, that's heading towards a close. I think the most interesting thing it's in India and Sri Lanka, and possibly neither of those hosts will make the semis. It might be Australia, South Africa, England, New Zealand. We'll see how it goes. India's still in with a reasonable chance. But the other thing, and I'm sure you noted this, is Tom Dumoulin ran a 2:29 marathon in Amsterdam last weekend. Did you see that?
Yeah, I saw that. He could have gone better if he'd done his pacing.
Exactly. Tom Dumoulin needs to join Discourse and learn about pacing. But he ran a 109, 110 first half. Mm-hmm. So he was on course to run a 2:20, which is pretty good going for It's really, really impressive. And the reason I brought it up is I think it makes him the fastest elite cyclist to run a marathon. No.
Possibly. Somebody will tell us.
Somebody will. I think there was a French cyclist who ran a 2:34, but I think this is the first elite cyclist I know of who's broken 2:30.
Cyclists are super fit, so why shouldn't they run fast marathons?
It's they just can't do the eccentric loading. I think their joints and their tendons and ligaments are just not conditioned to impact. So they're really good at pushing, but they're not very good at bouncing. And I wouldn't be surprised it would actually be a fascinating study, is to take 50 of the top World Tour pros and actually measure their running economy. I reckon a lot of them are incredibly inefficient because they just do not have that elasticity conditioned into their muscle and tendon.
Okay, so he's done well there, apart from his pacing.
Yeah, he can definitely be a 2:24 guy if he gets the pacing right, I reckon, next time.
We should race him against Harry Styles.
What did Styles do in Berlin?
3 hours.
Easy
You'll hammer him. Easy.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to set up next week. Oh no, you had two.
No, I was just going to.
I was going to set up next week's paper, which, if you're anything to do with endurance at all, you've probably seen this in the news this week. A paper's come out called Ultra Endurance Athletes and the Metabolic Ceiling. So we'll be looking, I think, at that next week. It's quite an interesting paper. So I think people have already started posting on Discourse about it because I posted a little bit earlier on. Yeah,
there's a thread on Discourse, I think you called the metabolic ceiling, is that right?
The metabolic ceiling, yeah.
The metabolic ceiling, and it's got a couple of replies, one of which is from Dr. Stu, who's always good value, always like really analytical, good with numbers. And he's basically posted a thought experiment and says, please feel free to blow a hole in my calculations. So we'll give a crack at that. I see mathematics has come on with a subsequent post. So I'm sure that topic is going to develop over the course of the next week. And that will be one that we put our spotlight on for you then. So that should be fun. And I'm sure there'll be many other things coming up. The Tour de France route is announced tomorrow. That was actually going to be another thing I was going to... And if I were them, I'd put 3 time trials a week, 15Ks to 25Ks each, so that might be close, because Remco might even have a chance.
No chance. You know who's going to win it.
Yeah, if they put a 240Ks worth of time trials in the race, maybe it'd be another story.
They're not going to.
No, of course. I'm being facetious now for the sake of...
Stop dreaming.
Yeah, I wish.
We'll have the same conversations next year.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's basically it. That was a really in-depth one. I hope we did justice to it. All the papers, as always, in the show notes. All the discussion, as always, over on Discourse. Really look forward to hearing from you, your thoughts on some of the things we've discussed. Thanks again, Gareth. And a massive thanks to all of you who are already patrons of our Science of Sport community. And we will speak to you all again next week. For now, goodbye.